Thursday, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Lee. I'm the president of WGU Academy, WGU's solution for college readiness. Welcome to all of you. WGU's mission is to change lives for the better by creating pathways to opportunity. We have three primary learner-focused objectives: completion, equity, and return on investment. Today's session begins a four-part webinar focusing on the directly related challenges of persistence and resilience among learners. The title of the series is Developing Adaptive Mindsets for the New World of Learning. Let me introduce the guides for today's session. And at the end of this session, my colleague Anna Frashu will close the session. Chelsea Barnett, first of all, is WGU Academy's Director of Product and Program Innovation. Prior to joining the Academy, she spent more than a decade at Western Governors University using data and focused course design to better the lives of students. As such, she designed, implemented, and scaled the first non-cognitive based course for the university, which now has been taken by over 60,000 students and has proven to increase student achievement, particularly for underserved populations. Chelsea championed the use of social emotional learning resources and research across the university and is seen as a resident expert in the field of experiential learning and research design. She holds a Master's of Science in Instructional Design and a Master of Science in Data Analytics. She continues to publish in peer-reviewed journals and has been recognized with multiple awards for her innovative projects in higher education. I work closely with Chelsea, and I'm excited to turn it over to her after I introduce the other panelists. Dr. Amit Futui is the Director of Learning and Innovation at WGU Labs. Dr. Futui's work focuses on the psychology of performance and motivation in the domains of academics, athletics, and workplace achievement. He earned a PhD in psychology from the University of Waterloo, after which he worked at Stanford University, where he co-founded the College Transition Collaborative, one of the largest multi-institution collaborations to deliver proven psychological interventions to over 40,000 students, as well as the Stanford Interventions Lab, a collaborative research group committed to sharing and scaling proven insights from psychology to promote better performance and well-being. Dr. Futui is a skilled trainer, having led 45 professional development workshops across the United States to help students, faculty, leaders, athletes, and corporations better understand the psychology of success and equip those groups with the tools they need to perform at their full potential. Finally, Dr. Reshma Gaurvajula is WGU Academy's research scientist. Here, she designs, implements, and evaluates interventions to better understand and improve student learning. She earned her PhD from Washington University in St. Louis, where her work focused on applying cognitive psychology research concepts to education. Dr. Gaurvajula, her area of expertise is on identifying and mitigating individual differences in memory and complex learning, both in and out of the classroom, using both quantitative and qualitative research methodology. Her research has helped to identify scalable strategies for individuals of all ages to improve their learning outcomes on typical educational measures and routine life tasks. All right, those are our panelists. Incredible to have the three of you with us today. I'm going to pass the baton over to Chelsea, who's going to take it from here. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. And my esteemed colleagues and I would love to thank you for spending some of your Thursday afternoon with us. We are excited to have this conversation with all of you. We intend for this to be a very interactive session as much as possible. And so we would like to invite you to place your comments in the chat. There is also a Q&A available to you. You'll find both of those buttons in the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen application. And we're also going to be using some polls throughout this session today. So we're actually going to start right off the bat with a poll. To help you get informed and acquainted to that technology, I'd like you to go ahead and click the three dots next to the chat in the bottom right-hand corner. You'll see a selection from Multimedia Viewer. That should bring up our poll. And I would like you to type 2 or 3 words that come to mind when you hear someone say the phrase non-cognitive skills. We're going to see, we should have a word cloud that comes up. See what people think of when you hear the phrase non-cognitive skills. Seeing some, Corey in the chat says not able to communicate well. Not seeing a word cloud yet to our AV team. Maybe perhaps we're having some tech challenges there. Skills and emotions, motivation, integrity, and social skills, processing challenges. Good. Regulation. Excellent. Looks like we're seeing, some of you are seeing the word cloud, so it's just not showing on my end yet. I'm glad that you're able to see it. So we're going to actually come back to this, these phrases and terms that you all are using as we start to dive into our session today. But over the next hour, we're actually going to talk about indicators of student success and the psychological principles behind what it takes to really develop resilient learners. What I mean by resilient learners are those that can weather the many, many challenges that our students are going to face over the course of their journeys in higher education. And when we talk about student success, there have been a lot of promises of quick fixes on the market, silver bullets, new strategies, and even advances in research. But still today, we have a decades-old problem of not all students being able to succeed in achieving a degree. Still today, too many of our students are leaving college saddled with large amounts of debt and without a credential that gets them meaningful employment. My colleagues and I are going to argue today that this is largely due to 2 issues. The first is that there remains too large of a gap between research and practice. That as we've had advances in social, in cognitive, and in educational psychology, that there has not been good pathways and mechanisms for institutions to be able to implement and scale practices that have been proven to be effective. And we are coming together today as experts and researchers who are really on the forefront of where research meets practice. And we're here to shed light on those emerging trends and how solutions are impacting the populations of students that we serve, particularly those students who haven't been served well by higher ed systems thus far. The second issue within the broad landscape of higher ed is that many people still believe that learning is purely a cognitive process. And what I mean by that is that we learn by being exposed to content, and then we proceed to absorb that content, which ultimately leads to mastery. But in reality, we know that learning is a social process, and that process has deep dependencies on our motivations, our beliefs, our thoughts, our emotions, our sense of belonging, our relationships with others, and that all of those things comprise many of the non-cognitive psychological constructs that we believe that students need to strengthen in order to really thrive within our educational systems. As few as 5 years ago, even, this concept of non-cognitive interventions, particularly in the systems of higher ed, was still largely in its infancy. But today there's a growing body of evidence that the intentionality behind incorporating this non-cognitive domain along with the more traditional cognitive and metacognitive domains brings about a much more holistic view of our students' needs and really enables them for transformative learning and what we're calling success within higher education. And this philosophy served as the impetus for creating WGU Academy. The 4-part webinar series that's going to take place over the next few months that's brought to you by Academy is really based upon this idea that combining college courses with non-cognitive skills training and personalized coaching can light a fire within students who are trying to find success within college. It can build desire, it can build confidence, resilience, and persistence that they need in order to be successful, not only in education, but ultimately within career and within personal goals and achievements that they seek after. So throughout our design and implementation of Academy, we have intentionally put research into practice, reducing the gaps between those two worlds that has existed, and try to fully incorporate non-cognitive scaffolding for our learners. And importantly, we want to make sure that we're doing that for all learners, especially those who have been historically underserved and called, frankly, non-traditional in the past, even though we know that that is becoming the traditional learner today. So again, we want to thank you for joining us. We want to encourage you to post your thoughts and comments in the chat. And now to really dive in and get this conversation started, I want to refer us back to that word cloud and the thoughts that we were generating about the terminology behind non-cognitive. And I want to start there by asking our panelists, what do these phrases mean? What does non-cognitive mean to you? So I'll throw it over to Reshma to start us off. What does non-cognitive mean?
Thank you, Chelsea, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. And I hope that the individuals who are having trouble hearing and accessing are able to hear us and access this webinar now. In terms of what non-cognitive means to me, I think that definition has changed a lot over the years and over my exposure to additional research and seeing how it's put into practice. But the way that I conceptualize it is a sort of large umbrella. It has to do with the behaviors and attributes that are associated with positive self-efficacy, growth mindset, having emotional regulation. Somebody in the chat called out earlier, having the skills for resilience, being able to bounce back. And so in a way, I define non-cognitive as the umbrella that holds all of these other constructs and skills underneath that I think are very necessary for success, both in the classroom, in careers, and really for a healthy life. Amit, do you have more to add to that?
Only as a commentary, and again, thank you all for joining us for this interactive conversation. Your input and questions and thoughts are welcome throughout this discussion today. What's clear to me, especially as we think about just the lack of clarity when we do talk about terms like non-cognitive, actually is an important revelation, which is that to date, no one has even attempted to try to address or target or even identify this content or this domain of skills acquisition that isn't specifically linked to what students learn in their courses, in particular topics like science and math and English. Those are easily manageable domains and topics, and that's why we talk about them as cognitive domains. But this sort of hands-off approach to say everything else that sort of is impactful and predictive of student success we'll call non-cognitive, and hope that somehow students will acquire those through their informal navigation of this academic journey. And because no one's taken ownership of it, there's a couple of things that have arisen, one of which we all have a bit of confusion around what this domain of skills acquisitions is. And second, that traditionally institutions have not taken ownership or responsibility for giving students access to this domain of training. What's happening now is we are seeing an emergence come out of this nebulous space where people are starting to realize that we have measures that demonstrate that some of these domains of non-cognitive skills, whether it's mindset, whether it's perceptions of belonging, are turning out to be incredibly predictive of student success and persistence. And so now there's an interest to try to figure out what are these experiences and how can we cultivate them in an effective and meaningful way. But it is also important to highlight that we are just at the beginning of this journey. And so the fact that there's still some openness to this domain also is promising in terms of how what we focus on and how we build up that curriculum in terms of supporting students and in their journey of growth?
It's interesting, Omid, because you know, a lot of times, even though it's growing within, I would say, at the educational systems, we still hear about it more within K through 12 than higher ed. And the argument that it applies within that age group largely, that it's something we should be learning at a younger age, and then an assumption that by the time you get to higher ed that you have mastered it, you understand those skills by then.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. And for those of us who've sort of been playing in the sandbox long enough, know that the way that it's commonly delivered in K to 12 is very programmatic and often delivered in a way that doesn't invite ownership of those skills. So when we talk about things like effective communication skills or effective emotional intelligence skills, they are doled out to individuals who are almost too young to really understand what those things mean and how to apply them in their own world. So they're very receptive vehicles of this, but they don't yet have the life experience to put those skills into context. What's also interesting, I think, especially as we've observed this past year and a half, almost 2 years, it feels like, of the pandemic, is that in the post-secondary space, we're realizing that students are really becoming aware of the lack of these skills in their own lives. Traditionally, we have outsourced the management of our times and a lot of these non-cognitive domains to traditional post-secondary institutions. What I mean by that, or even K-12 institutions, what I mean by that is if you show up to class, then somehow you know that the class is structured in such a way to help you stay focused, that the pressures of the norms and your peers being in class and the requirements of being present are forces that keep you engaged and showing up. But when that disruption happened over the pandemic and individuals were left to their own devices at home, they realized they were having a lot of difficulty staying focused, staying motivated, being able to understand how to connect a sense of purpose and relevance to everything that they're doing, and just uncertain about their place and the return on investment of the educational experience. So a lot of I would say areas that we have sort of, I would say, lazily outsourced to traditional educational institutions have come to the fore and have made realize that this additional domain of skills is crucial to being able to succeed in school. So again, I appreciate that K-12 has started to dabble in this space, especially with the things that are low-hanging fruit like growth mindset and grit, though I have my own thoughts about some of those content domains as well. I think there is this sort of dawning emergence and realization of the need and the urgency to train individuals with these non-cognitive skills in post-secondary today.
Yeah, and I think that something that the last year and a half, as you pointed out, Omid, has really made people question is the assumption even that before COVID, even before the world had to go online, that these skills are magically being administered to students just because they happen to be sitting in the classroom together, right? So assumptions around a sense of connectedness, either with the material, with the peers, with students' own lives, or a sense of belonging with the university system or the higher education system that they were in. I think I would hope that the last year and a half is really forcing a lot of educators to think about whether or not they've intentionally designed a student experience that brings motivation to the fore, that brings the sense of belonging to the forefront of everything they're doing, rather than just making the assumptions. But hearing about all of the experiences that students are having, either while they were, staying at home, attending school in isolation, or now when some students have gone back, or in the world of online education, where they don't feel that sense and their motivation and their focus suffers as a result, I think just goes to show that we still have a long way to go of bringing that back in together.
Yeah, that's a great point. And on that point, and Chelsea brought it up too, we've been hearing things like the importance of belonging, the importance of having an adaptive mindset and growth mindset. One of the foundational frameworks that I like to remind myself of is, as Chelsea mentioned, that when we think about learning, it's not just this content mastery process. It really is the social experience. And the analogy that I like that reminds me of this vividly is when you think of an individual, a child who's learning how to walk, they take a varying amount of time to acquire the skills to be finally able to take that leap of faith and take those first few steps. Now, in that process, which can span anywhere between 2 months to a full year and a half, there will be many stumbles along the way. And yet, when you look around, and I don't know that you need to put in the chat or raise your hand, but who among us doesn't know how to walk? Unless there's a physical limitation, most of us have become adept walkers, and we know that that is part of our identity. And if we go back to that initial experience of walking, when we stumbled, when we experimented, one thing that never happened is that we never doubted whether we would ever become walkers. We looked around and we saw that everybody around us was walking. We looked to our parents and caregivers and we realized that they had full faith that we would ultimately learn how to walk. And so there was no other option. And so when it comes to believing that you could be a walker, or believing that you could be a math student, or believing that you can be an English major, this need for belonging is profoundly important. And how it actually manifests itself is how, as we grow up and as we engage with new learning experiences, that social experience is one in which we experiment with new social identities. So for instance, my first exposure to a math class, if I have a negative experience in that math class, or if I get negative feedback, or I do really, really poorly, that might shut the door to that domain of competence, or that domain of performance. That might mean that I don't allow myself to experiment in that space where I can acquire the identity of being a math person. That door will be shut to me. And as we learn that as students navigate their learning and educational journeys, they navigate these moments when they have to experiment and wonder, do I belong in this space, in this domain of performance? Can I see myself doing well? Do I feel like I'm valued and cared for in this space? And if the answer ends up being no, because we get negative feedback from our professors, or we don't get peer encouragement, or there are looming, lingering negative stereotypes in the air, or we're contending with maladaptive mindsets, then again, that closes up to us up to those identities, and we aren't able to fully engage. Our minds are designed to protect ourselves. And when we feel like we're threatened, we disengage and we distance ourselves. Another really vivid example of how this plays out is sometimes when I work with athletes or student athletes, they will come to me and say, hey, can you help me do better in my math class? I just am not a math person, find this really hard. I don't know how to do it well. And then I start talking about other aspects of their experiences on campus, and often the conversation will gravitate towards their sports performance or their sports domain. And regardless of the sports in question, oftentimes they'll talk to me about what they do on a daily basis, much of which is actually pretty computational in nature. Like they'll tell me about the complex plays that they have to come up with in the moment that are critical when the stakes are high, and they're navigating all of these complex calculations in their minds. And in that regard and in that identity, they realize that they are an adequate and competent athlete. And yet when it comes to defining themselves as a math person, they've shut their minds to that possibility. So along the way, they probably have had that opportunity to experiment as a math person, but just were not validated. And these are one of the mindset skills that we are now learning more about, both in terms of how they can be internalized by the individual. So there's interventions and messages and programming and training that can be done, but also content that can be delivered to institutions, to faculty, to advisors that can better cultivate that sense of belonging. And it's just one of the examples of these non-cognitive skills that's coming to light in terms of being critically important to determining whether students do or don't succeed in their educational journey.
I think also, Amit, you brought up situations where belonging becomes in question, where we can quickly determine we do or don't. But in fact, isn't it also critical or perhaps even more dangerous when that is ambiguous for students? And as the population of our campuses continues to evolve, where we have more students who are parents, who are older, who are commuting, and are looking around and are questioning if they belong and can't quickly answer that, when every day they're confronted with more situations where they wonder in classrooms and interactions with faculty or peers if they belong and can't come to a conclusion of that answer, that leaves them in sort of this state of limbo, that stress puts on more threat for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'd love to sort of turn it back over to you all in terms of what you do with Academy. Essentially, you were born out of this space where students who were trying to be admitted into post-secondary program were denied access, basically told you don't belong here. And then Academy comes in and says, actually, yes, you do. And here's the path to being able to get there. But to your point, Chelsea, I think there are varying levels, or there are varying types of belonging concerns that are problematic. And much of the work that we're starting to really set the foundations for is based on first understanding what is the root cause that we're looking to address, so that then you can match that to the relevant solutions. And when it comes to belonging, there are generally three types of belonging that are problematic. The first one is interesting, is one in which some students actually know that they belong in a particular institution, but that they don't want to belong there. So for instance, imagine your local community college that has open enrollment. Basically, if you apply, you're going to get enrolled. And you show up and you look around and you think, you know what? Everyone else here is not very ambitious. And I know I belong here. I know I can do well here, but I don't really want to be here. And so even knowing that you belong sometimes can be problematic. And that's one of the first sort of domains of belonging problems. The second is belonging, knowing that you don't belong and being certain that you don't belong. So sometimes you go into an environment, whether it's a workplace, whether it's a social group, whether it's a post-secondary institution, and you're explicitly told that you don't belong, whether it's based on gender, age, race, and the cues are not subtle. It's overt discrimination, the racism, sexism that is expressed to you, and you are basically quite clearly told that you don't belong. And that's also very problematic and definitely core systemic issue that we need to address as a nation. But from the individual perspective, it's actually not as bad as what it could be if it's something that we'll get to next. And because you have clarity that you don't belong, that actually frees you up to look at your other options. You say, okay, I know I don't belong here. This place is not welcoming. And if you have the freedom, hopefully, to be able to explore other options, then you will do that in a very sort of timely fashion. The third domain of belonging that is quite problematic is belonging uncertainty, where you exist in the space of continuous uncertainty about whether you do or don't belong. So you're constantly questioning, what does this mean? Do I belong? Do people like me really belong in a place like this? And what that leads to is a series of cognitive taxes where you are essentially exerting cognitive resources to try and resolve this question in your mind. So first, there's an experience of stress that comes from not being sure whether you do or don't belong. The second is that there's an increased vigilance in terms of whether or not you do or don't belong. And then there's the depletion of your working memory that you actually need, typically when you're looking at studying or testing. And that all of those contribute to lead to underperformance. Now, it begins with an uncertainty about whether you do or don't belong. That bogs down your working memory and capacity, which causes you to underperform, and in turn reinforces the initial worry about whether you do or don't belong. And so you do find this recursive process where the uncertainty leads to more maladaptive outcomes and then reinforces that maladaptive belief. And again, this is one of those domains that I think can be addressed. In fact, there's decades of research showing that psychological intervention, and with the work that you all are doing in Academy, you can address and bolster a sense of belonging in students as they navigate critical transitions. And I know that you all are doing a lot of this work with Academy.
Yeah, I think that another piece to what you just said, Omid, that is really important is that it's not just that feeling of not belonging or having that uncertainty at the beginning. You can fluctuate in where you're at, right? And so depending on the feedback that you receive, suppose that you're highly motivated as you join a college program, you have some apprehension about your performance, but you're studying well, you're reading through the textbooks, and then you receive a terrible grade on what you perceive to be a terrible grade on your first assessment. That can send some people into a cycle, and exactly what you're talking about, Omid, of receiving that feedback reinforces a negative perception of yourself and your abilities, your identity as a college student, your identity as a student in that class. And so what we believe and what the evidence is showing is that having a foundational skills building in these non-cognitive areas can really help create and build resilience in events of those setbacks, in the cases where there is perceived failure, right? So we're not always going to succeed at everything we do. It's the idea that in order to really thrive in college, in your career, in your life, you need to be able to bounce back from those setbacks. And the most beautiful course, the most stunning strategy about how to study, about how to time it, manage your time, how to set goals, might not help you if your motivation takes a hit, if your own self-efficacy takes a hit, if you believe that your intelligence and your abilities are a box and there's, tight corners, there's walls in place, and you can't go beyond that. There's a lot of great conversation happening in the chat about how this can sometimes involve mind hacks, or it can involve really reframing and thinking about your brain. And one of the things at Academy that we do is really highlight to our learners the idea of neuroplasticity, which is a very fancy word and just means that our brains are capable of change. You don't always have to take the same route to work. You can take another route. You can change your thoughts. You can change your behavior patterns. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how many transfer credits you have or have not gotten. It's the idea that you can have growth and you can have positive change. Chelsea, you've had a lot of impact on that sort of curriculum and thinking about mindsets. Do you have anything to add here?
I think I was just going to add that even the concept and the way that we represent neuroplasticity in our different metaphors over the years has evolved. I can remember that for a long time, we used to represent it like a computer chip, and the idea that you could make new connections, right? And you could even see these visuals of different line patterns that could be made upon the computer chip, and that your brain could make new pathways on this chip. But they've actually tried to do away with those metaphors in recent years, because if you think about a computer chip, it's still a solid shape, right? And it still has boundaries and lines that you can't exceed. But in fact, your brain and these new pathways that can form are sort of unlimited. And so you want something that can change shape and grow over time, no matter how old you are. Again, you have to think about obviously disease and limitations that we might encounter through illness, but that, no matter, something that can be really moldable is more what the new metaphors that are abounding in neuroscience are coming out, trying to get away from people thinking about something that is limited in form, and how beautiful that is for us. And actually even new research coming out around Alzheimer's to say, hey, if you want to avoid these things, you have to challenge yourself every single day of your life. And it can't be something that you challenge and then learn quickly. It has to be something that you fail at. You want to avoid issues with memory and dementia and Alzheimer's. You need to fail every single day. You need to try to pick up learning a new language. And as soon as you start to learn that new language, you stop and you try a different one, and really push your brain and your capacity to its limits. And how do we think about that in terms of translating that to our students, and showing them the beauty of failure and what we take from that? And how does that apply to grades and exams and standardized tests, and do we view those things in the same way? And the answer is probably not, right? We're actually telling them that they should master things and become proficient. So I just think about the dissonance between those two concepts and really what our capacity is as humans.
Yeah, and I appreciate all of those sort of evolutions and essentially the tools that are used when it comes to some of these mindset skills. If I may, I'm going to make a blatant oversimplification of a lot of this content. And in fact, I'll even go further to say that when it comes to beliefs, they can generally fall into one of two categories. Either beliefs that enhance and expand one's willingness to engage, or beliefs that restrict and cause us to want to disengage. So again, oversimplification, but our mind that is evolved to survive is always making meaning of, is this friend or is this foe? Is this threat or is this something that is meaningful and useful? And that is exactly where the ambiguities are relevant, because as we navigate our day-to-day experiences, whether it's with our faculty member, our parents, our teachers, our family, our content that we're learning, we have to also associate a meaning to those experiences. So if I open a textbook and it's hard, it's content I don't yet know, what does that mean to me? What does that emotion signal to me about my place and my potential and my competence in this place, in this moment? And the depth or the answers that we conjure to answer the questions that come to mind determine whether we do or do not engage. And so some of these tools, like demonstrating that learning really is based on a process where you push yourself, where you challenge yourself, where the myelin sheath leads to this this growth of the brain, is a really useful metaphor and mindset to understand how to make meaning of challenge, difficulty, and uncertainty. And many of these mindset strategies could be categorized as such. When faced with challenge, difficulty, or setback, what are the questions that your mind poses? And then what are the answers available to answer those questions? That's where mindset skills come into play. What are the available heuristics? What are the available interpretations and explanations that we have at our disposal that help us make meaning of these situations? Now, without mindset skills training, we have to basically leave it to the existing cultural perceptions and beliefs that are out there. So the cultural perception that intelligence is this innate trait that some people have more or less of, that there are the brilliant individuals in society like Einstein, who for whom studying and learning comes easy and naturally. And so when things get hard, if we think that intelligence is this fixed trait, then that difficulty signals to us that we're not one of the smart ones, and therefore, why should I bother? When I'm having an ambiguous interaction with a professor and it's not as warm as it used to be as it was in high school, does that mean that this professor does not value my input and my time? Or does it mean that they're just busy with a larger classroom? And so how I answer that question determines whether I feel like I do or don't belong, and then whether I engage or disengage. So broadly speaking, as we think about beliefs, are they constricting or are they expanding? And being able to navigate and offer individuals with a set of mindsets or beliefs that are expanding is one of the ways in which we can get people to basically stay engaged and be okay. Another question that I get asked a lot in terms of psychology is and learning is like, what is the optimal psychological state of learning? Is it one in which where you're super keen, you're super focused, very curious, hyper alert, extremely energized? And the answer is no, not really. The optimal psychological state of learning is one in which you're just okay. What that means is that your cognitive mind is not working overtime to make meaning of the cues that are in the environment. And what that does is it frees you up to absorb and digest and interact and criticize the content that's in front of you. But for that psychological state to be okay, you need to have in place these core mindset beliefs that make you understand that difficulty means that you're growing and you're getting smarter, that ambiguous interactions are a normal part of the transition to college, that sometimes doing boring work still adds some purpose to what you're here to do. But that's exactly what you're trying to achieve, is to quiet the mind so that you're able to engage with the learning content in a way that really is meaningful to you.
One of the things that I think showed up in the chat, I want to say somebody named Adrienne pointed this out, of this seems like it's directly related to DE&I. And we've all had this conversation a lot of times, and a lot of what you're talking about, Omid, just reminded me that there are obviously there are a lot of inequities in society, and there are a lot of inequities in education. And so Chelsea made this point earlier of how the historically non-traditional student is becoming more and more of the traditional student, but there are still a lot of psychological weight and burden that these populations have, especially when they're starting something as daunting as a long-term college experience. So thinking about first-generation students who don't have a lot of that historical context that they've heard from their parents, thinking about low-income individuals who are trying to break the cycle of poverty and for whom failure might have a greater weight on it than it does for somebody who doesn't have that burden in their life. And then thinking about students of color, where there are systemic inequities that exist that can make earning an education much more difficult. And so all of this, I think, to me, again, just highlights the importance of building a more growth mindset, having a more positive reaction to failure, but also recognizing why certain thoughts and behavior patterns exist in you that, again, are never too late to break.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think as we think about this curriculum, this mindset curriculum, and as Chelsea mentioned, it's a hidden curriculum, one in which you're expected and assumed to understand how to navigate learning and education as an enterprise. Now, when it comes to access and social capital, we know that there's an inequity. If you have a parent, a brother, an aunt, an uncle who's navigated the educational track, then they can guide you and even help you make sense of the ambiguities that you encounter. So if you have an initial set of concern or anxieties about going to college, they'll sit next to you and say, it's okay, I've been through it, and it's normal when you're trying to contemplate doing something challenging and amazing. But what if you don't have that? What if as you're contemplating the cost of college, the anxiety fills you up and your conclusion is that I can't afford, literally I cannot afford to go to college. And so some people do have the privilege of having someone help them understand that there's financial aid available, that these things do pass with time, that the return on investment is typically well worth the cost. And also things that are more benign, like how is it that you make meaning of the moments in which you struggle or are challenged? One of the cultural narratives that is actually pretty common is this bootstrap mentality. This notion that when things get hard, that somehow you're supposed to find a little bit more within yourself and pull yourself out of whatever slump you're in. That is the definition of being gritty, and that's a great thing. Let's be gritty. But if you think of it as a definition, it's a contradiction. When you have nothing left to give, you have nothing left to give. And instead, when you actually observe resilience organically and dynamically playing out in life, you realize that resilience is something that people create by leaning on their networks. That as things get hard, they engage early on the resources that are available to support them and get them out of that slump. And that's why when it comes to this being relevant to DEI, there's this aspect of these implicit expectations and strategies that's hidden from a lot of individuals just from sheer lack of access. And the other is that timing is incredibly critical. That if an individual is transitioning into college for the first time and they don't even know how to enroll in a class, they have to contend with a lot of the negative stereotypes that might make them wonder, do I belong? If there's no one around me that looks like me, there might be a reason If I can't even understand how to enroll for a class, what does that mean about me and my potential to succeed in this college when I haven't even started my classes? So there's a lot of mindset that is relevant in terms of how we allow individuals to engage and stay engaged, and timing is critical. And so it becomes an issue of inequity when we realize that most of those, without having had the privilege of access, get pushed out or even kept from even applying and getting into college because of these mindset issues that they contend with in a way that is inequitable. So absolutely, I think this mindset curriculum is very related to issues of DEI and equity, and how we are able to make sure that we are providing a more equitable access to these mindset skills is a core part of the mission for this work.
There was a question in the chat very early on in the session asking about how to address this for faculty who often sort of feel the stress of having how to teach these skills, these foundational mindset skills to students alongside of the burden of all the other content that they need to help students master. And I think building off of what you were just addressing, Omid, with the concept of this hidden curriculum for our first generation students who may not have those exemplars in their life, what I would just like to say is that there's an opportunity for us as faculty to build it into our own classrooms through modeling and really some healthy vulnerability, right? Talking about these concepts we've highlighted today around embracing failure as a part of learning, around normalizing these concepts of what it is to belong, right? And having open, candid conversations about expectations around how to ask for help, around help seeking as a leadership skill set, around what it means to have a growth mindset in your classroom. Those are all things that you can do that model those healthy mindsets for your students that don't explicitly require you to teach something in a part of your curriculum, but that humanize you as a faculty member, that you can talk about your experiences and the struggles that you might have had in college with learning something that was difficult, maybe questions that you had about whether or not you could master something, about whether or not you were good enough at something. Little steps that you can take and share with students that can help them feel like they belong potentially and see that there's opportunity there.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really valuable. And part of what you're talking about, Chelsea, lifts the burden off the learners themselves, right? So a lot of help seeking is very, very important behavior, and it's valuable across all sorts of domains, but it's also very challenging for people, especially those who have potentially trauma in their life or just a long series of difficult experiences. And so there's a lot of chat going on around mentors and how proactive outreach can be really helpful. At Academy, we have coaches who are certified and, regard students with what is termed as unconditional positive regard. It's basically allowing students to have the opportunity to take these skills, to Omid's point earlier, recognize how to utilize those skills and find meaning and connection with their own life and build upon what they're learning in the classroom. So I don't think anybody here can expect that this sort of learning happens overnight. Sadly, it takes a much longer time than that, and it's not linear in any way, but having a support network and coaches at Academy are a great example of that, with the proactive outreach and offering an outlet for people to utilize these skills, because as with everything, practice helps a lot. And recognizing how to improve behaviors and thought patterns a little bit at a time can be very, very valuable.
I'll only add that I completely resonate with the concerns from any educator who's like, how do we even address this as we began this session? There's not even any clarity on what non-cognitive skills domains is. It's like everything else that no one really has a grasp about. I think what's happening, at least with this group, and I know there's sort of parallel efforts across the nation, is to try to identify those critical domains to offer clarity. Because I think as leaders, one of the greatest things that we can do is clarify the ambiguous, clarify the complex. And that's relevant for ourselves too. What is it that we can focus and target initially? Well, without having a clarity of what these mindset skills are, it's kind of hard to jump in and know where to invest those resources. But the good news, there's two bits of good news. One is that we are honing in on probably a handful, maybe close to a dozen or so of these critical mindset strategies and domains of mindset that really have the greatest leverage potential. And we're building out that content. I think hopefully what we'll be able to do is I'm hearing more and more through these conversations that there might be a need to articulate what those are and then share those out with some of the folks involved in these conversations. So if you're interested, there'll be some contact information at the end. I'd encourage you to let us know. And the other is that these mindsets are not only relevant for being able to support your students, but they're also relevant for your own work. So a common concern that we hear from students is a very similar thing. It's like, how do I manage all of the demands that I have? My time demands, my parents, my job demands, my family demands, my work demands, my study demands. Well, it turns out that one of the mindset skills is focused on being able to better manage competing demands. And it's not that hard. Many of these strategies, I like to remind myself, while they can have compounding effects over the long run, and they can lead to dramatically significant changes in outcomes, they don't require dramatic shifts or investments to initiate that shift in path. What I mean by that is that small investments starting early can accumulate over time to lead to these significant effects over time. So things like, as you start to notice that every time you're opening a textbook or every time you're about to do something hard, you notice that within yourself there's an emotion of anxiety. And intentionally you can start to train yourself to address that emotion and help to remind yourself that anxiety actually means that you're in a state of optimal learning, that you're pushing yourself to do something new, that's something that you don't yet know how to do. And instead of taking that emotion of anxiety as a signal that you shouldn't be doing this, over time you will build up the skill to know that this is exactly what you should be doing. And a lot of these mindset skills are actually the same. They sort of compound over time, and when applied early, they can lead to pretty solid skills across time as well.
Well, I want to thank you, Omid, and the rest of the panelists for this insightful discussion. I think we have a few minutes left for any questions. So if you do have any questions, please put it in the chat. We've been answering all these questions as we go along. But we have a few more minutes, so feel free to put the questions in the chat. Again, we look forward to receiving your feedback. You'll see that in the chat. There is an email address where you could send us an email with any thoughts or questions you may have. We also have a link to a survey and certificate of attendance. Please click on the link. We really appreciate your feedback, so we would love for you to complete that survey. I also invite you to reach out to me, Anna Freshu. I'm the Director of Strategic Alliances at Academy, or our President, Chris Lee, with any questions and thoughts that you can have. And you can also get our email addresses in this chat. We do have one quick question, and I think we have a few more minutes to answer this. So this question is from Nancy. Are non-cognitive skills similar to soft skills and marketable skills?
I'm happy to try to address that. There's no clear answer yet, but I think as we're realizing that there is this nebula of domains of skills, we're also finding ways to categorize them more effectively. I would say non-cognitive skills is probably the most inclusive term that includes non-cognitive SEL skills, emotional intelligence, those kinds of things, including mindset. But as you dive in more specifically, there are these distinctions between these domains that again offer better clarity about what the core issue is that you're trying to address, and also what are the relevant strategies that you're trying to build up. I'd say the work that this group is trying to do and really sort of make progress on is focused on what I would call mindset skills, those set of core beliefs and core skills that do allow you to stay engaged in an adaptive way. Reshma, Chelsea, anything to add there?
Yeah, I would add that I think of non-cognitive skills as sort of an overarching umbrella, and then there are various frameworks that live under that. Some of those frameworks have a greater emphasis on sort of the social or interpersonal skills, right, in our relationships. Other frameworks are more focused internal. Those would be like the mindsets and beliefs that we have about ourselves. Soft skills, I would tend to categorize under more of those interpersonal or relationship type skills, those external communication skills. So you can think of it as living within a framework under that broader umbrella of non-cognitive skills. So the broader answer is yes, it's related, but within sort of a subset of a particular type of non-cognitive skill.
Great. Thank you. For those of you who are part of another institution, community college, university, or community-based organization, we are happy to meet with you to discuss how Academy can partner as a solution to help your students succeed. You'll find our contact information in the chat. Our next session of this series is on November 15th at 12 p.m. Mountain Time. This session is titled Understanding Performance States, Stress, Threat, and Rest. We'll continue this conversation by looking at how high stress moments can threaten a student's confidence and strategies that can lead to optimal performance. We hope you'll join us again, and we look forward to connecting soon. Thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.